that we've covered the function basis, let's now talk about parameters and arguments. So I realized that if you are new to programming, you're going to be hearing a lot of new words in these lessons. And one thing I will say is that when you are learning anything new, the hard thing isn't necessarily the concept, it's often the language. And it doesn't really matter if it's programming, medicine, or even cooking. Every field have its own jargon and its own words. So, a big part of learning Python programming is learning some of these vocabularies. I'm going to be doing my best to introduce you to these vocabularies slowly over the course of these lessons. Looking at the code we've written previously, we will see that functions take inputs. So for example, this index function here had an input of 4.5, and our count function here had an input that was an alphabet in a form of a string. And all of these inputs to the function go in between the parentheses after the function name. Our getMilk function had no inputs, and this is the same with the upper function, which also has no inputs. In contrast, this count function has a piece of text between the parentheses, and this piece of text was the input to the function. These inputs are called arguments. So let's create our own function that takes an input. That way, we can put all of this into practice and see how the code actually works. So I'm gonna modify my code of getMilk function. Inside my parentheses here, I'm gonna specify an amount, and this amount is gonna be our input to our function. Finally, I'm gonna modify our third print statement down here. So I'm gonna use formatted string and then use curly bracket here where it says by, and then embed the value of amount. So let's call this function to see it in action. Down below my code here, I'm gonna say getMilk, which is the name of the function, followed by the parentheses, and then within the parentheses I'm gonna put single quotes and then 5. And when I actually run the code, now we see that the piece of text we've entered between the parentheses shows up in our print statement. So let's call this function again, but this time with a different amount. And instead of the string here, I'm going to pass in an integer value of 10. And when I run the code, then this time around, we get back our message with the value 10. Now, let's look at this code and think carefully about what's going on. Our getMilk function takes one input, and that input has a name and it's called amount. But the real cool part is how amount is just a placeholder. The value of amount is determined by whatever we specify when we call our getMilk function. In other words, amount behaves just like a variable. It gets its value when we call the function, and every time we refer to amount in the body of the function, we are able to use the value that is stored inside. Now, there is two other things that you might notice about the code we've just wrote. First, let's try to call this function with empty parentheses. And when I execute the code, then in this case, we get a type error. And the details of this error message reads, missing one required positional argument, amount. In other words, because we've defined our function with an input, so we must provide it. We specified one parameter in the function header, so we must give a value. Because we can't just leave it out. The other thing that you'll also notice at this point is that print is nothing than a function as well. Print takes a piece of text as an input and print it out on the console. So if print is a function, then that means we are calling a function inside our function. So now, here is a quick recap. When working with functions with input, we specify what the input is upfront beforehand when defining the function. The input is specified between the parentheses following the function name. In this example, the input is called money, and money is just a placeholder. In programming jargon, when referring to input as a placeholder or a variable, we tend to call it a parameter. As in, getMilk has one parameter called money. And when we call the function, we must provide a value to this parameter. In this case, we must provide a number, and that number is going to be 20 when I call this function. The value that is passed to a function is being called an argument. Now, oftentimes, you'll see the words parameter and argument used interchangeably. But if you want to express yourself precisely or get technical, then it's good to know these definitions. A parameter is when we are referring to the input to a function that we are talking about it as a placeholder. And we use the word argument when we are talking about the actual value that we are giving to the function when we are calling it. So we've covered quite a few different kinds of functions so far. For example, we've understood the syntax behind upper, and we also understood the syntax behind count or index. Upper has no argument, but the count and index has an argument. Now, we're going to be looking at functions with multiple arguments. We've actually encountered multiple arguments when we call the replace function for replacing the letter O with the letter I in our string, welcome to Softlinks. So we can see that these two arguments are separated by a comma. But let's actually create our own function and have it to take more than one argument so that we can see this in practice. So back to getMilk function we've created earlier. I'm now going to modify this function. I'm also going to change the number of parameters that are in between the parentheses. So after amount, I'm going to add another parameter. I'm going to add a destination, and we're going to use this parameter in our second print statement. So instead of printing walk to the store, we use formatted strings and add our curly bracket here. Then pass in our destination, which means we're going to concatenate whatever is passed in as destination and then print it out on the console. So let's try out our function. In getMilk, when we call the function, for amount, I'm going to pass in 20, then comma, and for destination, I'm going to write in single quote, main store. Here we can see that our first argument, which is 20, and our second argument, which is destination, in a string. And when I run the code, then we see that these values were substituted in our print statement accordingly. Now, here is the question. What do you think will happen instead of saying getMilk 20 main store? We write getMilk main store then 20. And when we run the code, then we get walk to 20 by main store milk. So what this tells us is that our arguments to our function are passed by their position. In other words, the order in which we give the input to our function matters. The arguments are passed from left to right. So as before, we must supply exactly two arguments when we are calling getMilk. But we also must be careful to supply this argument in the right order. Looking at the syntax for calling a function, one important thing to note is that Python provides an alternative for passing arguments by their position. We can also match our arguments by providing a name. In other words, we can add the name of our parameters to the function call so that Python will match its value by keywords. So if we say destination is equal to main store and amount is equal to 20, and when we run the code, then we can see that the output on the console updates to the way we want it to be, namely walk to the main store, buy 20 milk. So here we are setting the destination equal to main store and we are setting amount equal to 20. But let me actually show you this. If we say get milk and then pass in 20, then comma destination equals to main store. And when we run the code, then in this case, the argument 20 is set by position and the destination is set by name. Now, the thing about named argument is that they make the Python code much more readable. It's like having labels for the data. But let me ask you this. What do you think will happen if we call our function like this? Get underscore milk, parentheses, main store, comma, amount equals to 20. When I run the code, then we see that we get a type error. And the reason is that we are trying to assign a value to amount twice. The first time we are assigning the stored value to amount because Python is evaluating our argument by their position. And the second time we are setting amount to 20 by using the keyword. Okay, cool. We've now come to the end of this tutorial on functions, parameters, and arguments. And we've covered a lot of material here. And this material will sink in more with practice, I promise. So, see you in the next lesson. Take care.